Hello and welcome to AP Daily. I'm Dr. Swope and I teach at Northwest High School in Germantown, Maryland. And as you can see from the screen, we're going to start introducing psychology. And so when we look at what are we going to do in this video and what are we going to learn, it's important to know that we got to know what psychology is. And you can imagine on the first day of school, whether it's a college class, high school class, online, in person, some kind of hybrid. On the first day of class, almost every teacher or professor writes on the board, what is psychology? And then they're going to quickly define it. And they're going to say psychology is translated as the study of the soul or the mind. And you can imagine students are diligently writing notes and they get that. But when you think about it, that's not really that helpful because what is the mind? And that's something that has perplexed philosophers and even the first cave people sitting around the first cave fire saying, well, what is the mind? What am I? What am I doing? And so when we look at what is the mind, we got a couple questions. So let me pose it this way. Do you have a mind? And of course everyone's going to nod, but then if you really think about it, if you have a mind, that means the mind's a possession, right? Like a laptop. But then who is the you that holds it? So now we're getting a little bit deeper, right? What if we said this? Are you a mind? Is the mind what you are, or is the mind what you have? Where is the mind? Now, that's an interesting approach, and we're going to use that word in the upcoming videos. It's an interesting approach to study psychology. Where is the mind? Because you could look at it in MRI or other scanning technologies, or you could do a dissection and say, well, where is this thing called the mind? And so these are really interesting questions that help us get at what is this thing we're going to be studying. Now, some people say that the mind is what the brain does, and that's a pretty clever phrase, but that doesn't really answer the question. I mean, it's nice to throw around, but it still doesn't advance the cause here. Okay, what if we ask the question differently? Can the mind be reduced like matter? Can it be reduced to its basic elements? And what if we say the mind is made of thoughts? That sounds great. The mind is made of thoughts. Well, that's not really helpful because we don't know what thoughts are. We can't define thoughts. So notice that psychology is a study of the mind, but we're not even sure what the mind is. So, we've got our work cut out for us going forward in this course called AP Psychology. Let's try something different, okay? Let's try to find out what the mind is not. So we can't really find out what the mind is. We can't find out where the mind is. So let's find out what the mind is not. I want you to think of something that's not connected to the mind. And I don't think you can. Because if you could think of it, well, then by definition, it's connected to the mind. Okay, if psychology were easy, we'd call it any other science. And why is that? Well, while every science uses the same scientific method, the subject of what psychologists study is so much more difficult than cells and molecules and atoms. Consider that an element is going to react to another element in the same way every time. A molecule of oxygen is the same as any other molecule of oxygen. But people are messy. We're very different from each other, and we're different from ourselves. When are you the most you? That's another one of those philosophical questions. Are you the most you in the morning? Well, if you're a teenager, probably not. Are you with friends? Are you with family? So if you were a psychologist, when would be the best time to study your mind? Let's jump into some early psychology. And that's important kind of on our first video to see our roots, and then we're going to kind of progress throughout the rest of the course. Psychology has a rich and interesting history, full of like soap opera-like drama, amazing discoveries, and even some really, really dark experiments. And you'll get to those as the course progresses. Two of the earliest approaches to studying psychology are structuralism and functionalism. But to study them, we got to know the names of a few of kind of the early psychologists. First, let's talk about Wilhelm Wundt, and it's important to pronounce him that way. The W's are pronounced with a V. He is known as the father of psychology, and he founded a laboratory in 1879. You don't need to know the date, but it just kind of gives you an idea that psychology is a relatively young science. This is important. Founding a lab is important because that lab was the starting line of psychology as a science and not just as an offshoot of philosophy. Edward Titchener was one of Wundt's students, and he took many of Wundt's ideas back to the United States and coined the term structuralism. Structuralism is studying the mind by trying to look at what it's made of. One of the problems with this approach is that the research methods that were used, for instance, one of the ways to study what the mind was made of was called introspection. And the gist of it was asking a person to observe themselves think. And it would be asking you to do a complex math problem and not just do it in your head, but watch yourself do it in your head. And if you're watching yourself, you're not doing it. But if you're doing it, you're not watching it. So you can see the flaw with this is, how do you study the mind using introspection? And like I just said, this was doomed because one of the facts in psychology is that a person cannot actively pay attention to more than one thing at a time. And that's been proven over and over in multiple experiments. Now let's look at functionalism. To do that, we need to talk about William James. While Wundt created the first psychology lab, James wrote the first psychology textbook. As James famously said, the first psychology lecture he ever heard was the one he gave. Psychology was a brand new science. Functionalism is an attempt to study what the mind does or its function. The mind, like any trait, serves a function. Okay, so let's look at this. Elephants' trunks, giraffes' necks, and polar bears' fur all serve a function. I think you could kind of argue that they've evolved for a certain reason. So did the human mind. What function does the mind serve in its many characteristics? For instance, what function does forgetting serve? What about getting distracted? What function does that serve? It's not an accident. And you can see traces of the theory of evolution in there. In fact, the evolutionary approach is one way to study mind and behavior. Now let's look at structuralism and functionalism. And I'm going to pause here and say it's important that we compare these. And you're going to see in the upcoming videos, it's important to be able to compare, analyze, discuss, and digest. Those are going to be skills you're going to see throughout the course of AP Psychology, that it's not just enough to know the names of things. You've got to understand the ideas and kind of cross-reference them with each other. So let's compare the two ideas of structuralism and functionalism. Actually, Wundt and James were quite the rivals, and each one was convinced that his approach to psychology was the best. So let's compare it this way. Imagine a structuralist and a functionalist were walking on a cobblestone street in 1900. That's 20 years after Wundt's lab and 10 years after James's textbook. They come across a modern day computer, and they both recognize the keyboard and have a very, very basic idea of what it can do. So they want to study it. The question is how to study this amazing machine. And we're going to use, obviously, that's a metaphor for the mind. And so we're going to look at how these two gentlemen would take apart, look at a laptop. Ready? A structuralist would want to take it apart to see what it's made of, what structures are in there. And that's Wundt's idea and Titchener's idea of, let's see what the mind is made of. A functionalist will want to press the keys and turn it on, what functions it can do. And that's James's idea. What can the mind do? What should the mind do? So what should we take away from our time on this video? Well, we looked at what is the mind and how we should study it. We examined the difficulty of, you can't dissect it, you can't observe it. So how do we study the mind? Particularly the idea that not all minds are the same. There's 7 billion different minds. So does that mean we have to come up with 7 different definitions of what is psychology? Each one of those minds changes every minute. Now, we also looked at early psychologists, Wundt, Titchener, and James and their ideas. And we scratched the surface that there are many different approaches to studying the mind. We looked at 2 of those approaches, structuralism and functionalism. Now, while those approaches are still in the history of psychology, our next video is going to look at modern approaches. Let's take a look at, let's do this again. Well, let's practice. Let's see what we've learned here. Who would do what? James and Wundt are walking down the street and come across a modern day sports car. Who would want to drive it and who would want to look under the hood? Okay, so we're going to take a quick 1 second. What name would you put under drive it and what name would you put look under the hood? Don't worry, I've done all the work for you with a simple click. We're going to find out that William James is a functionalist. He'd want to hop in, turn on the car, and let's see what it can do. And then Wilhelm Wundt is going to look under the hood, take the car apart and say, what makes it a car? What makes it do and what makes it what it is? Thank you for watching. This is the first in a series of AP Daily. I hope you will watch all of the videos to prepare you for doing well in your AP Psychology class and your AP Psychology exam. Thank you.